Deemed rebate paperwork requirements. I wanted to start today with a quote from a movie I enjoy, Happy Gilmore. To set the scene, Happy Gilmore was a hockey player turned golf pro who started playing the sport professionally in order to raise money to save his grandma's house. And while he had a great long game, he was really horrible at putting. And at one point in the movie, he does the impossible, which is to make a hole-in-one on a par 4. Now, if you're familiar with the sport, you know that that's really an impossible feat. But hey, it's Hollywood and anything's possible. And after he makes the shot, does a little celebration, he then leans over to his coach and says the following: "Oh man, that was so much easier than putting. I should just try and get the ball in one shot every time." Happy Gilmore. And this is a really important lesson. Rebate paperwork, whether you're new to the game or you've been around for a while, getting it right and understanding the finer details of what's required will help you take a few strokes off your game. And with a little practice, I'm confident you'll be able to get a hole-in-one every time. And in order to consistently be able to hit a hole-in-one, you'll need to be able to view your paperwork through the lens of a rebate processor. The reason being is that we simply can't teach all the nuances and the different variations of what might be required on your paperwork in every single situation. However, having an understanding of what they're looking for and what they're tasked to do will make sure you have a much easier go with things. Now, to use another sports analogy, you might think of the processing team as the referees in an NFL game. They're there to make sure that everybody follows the rules and to call the game fairly. Because if we don't, then the CPUC starts to question whether or not PG&E is the rightful administrators of the program. And so while you might not always agree with the calls they make, the work that they do is incredibly important. In order to view your project through the lens of a rebate processor, it's important to understand the 3 guiding principles that drive them. The first is, are you following the rules? This refers to the terms and conditions of the rebate program. If you haven't done so already, be sure to watch the video on this topic. The second is, does this project meet the eligibility requirements stated in the rebate catalog? I'll go into more detail on this topic in this video. And the third is that the correct rebate code is being applied. Now that you have a basic understanding of what the rebate processors are looking for when they review your paperwork, let's review what we're going to talk about today. First, we'll give a quick overview of the process. We'll talk about the information you'll want to collect from your customer. We'll look at the supporting documents with a heavy emphasis on the invoice. And then we'll look at some common mistakes. Looking at the process, step 1 is you will collect the necessary information from your customer. You'll then prepare the paperwork, and then finally you'll submit the application through Energy Insight. This video will cover the first 2 steps. Attention all salespeople and business development folks, when you meet with your customer, here's the information you're going to want to collect because it's going to be needed when you go to submit your application. First is the 3rd page of the PG&E Energy Statement, the year the facility was built and the building type, customer contact info to include email address and a cell phone number. We'll need the business tax ID number and the tax status if the customer is the payee. If you, the contractor, are the payee and you're submitting the application through Energy Insight, then we're not going to need your tax ID number because we will have already had that when you signed up to use the program. It's important to note, however, that the customer's tax ID number and tax status is required if they plan to use on-bill financing. We'll also need a signed project contractor and permit certification form. You can download that at the URL shown here. And then finally, when you meet with your customer, you want to ask if they participated in the rebate program in the last 5 years. This goes back to the terms and conditions of the program. If the customer is unsure, you can check with your trade professional manager. Just send them an email with the account number. Let's take a look at page 3 of the Energy Statement. And the reason why you want page 3 is because oftentimes a customer will have multiple service IDs attached to a single account and multiple service addresses if they have multiple locations. And what you're trying to obtain is 3 things. 1, you need the service agreement ID, the service address, and you're looking for the service address that matches the installation address, and then also the rate schedule. The service agreement ID is found over on the left-hand side of the bill on page 3. Again, you just want to make sure that you're looking at the service address to make sure you have the correct one. Then there's the rate schedule, and this isn't necessarily required for the rebate paperwork. However, if you're trying to calculate the return on investment on an energy efficiency project, it's important to know what they pay per kilowatt hour. And you can look up the rates if you do a web search for PG&E commercial rates. You'll then click on the link as it's shown here. So for all rebate projects, there are essentially 3 forms that are required. Sometimes more, and we'll get into that. But you're always going to need a invoice, a project contractor license permit certification form, and a spec sheet. We'll start with the invoice, and I'm going to spend some time on this because this is where a lot of folks can get hung up. And if you want to get that proverbial hole-in-one, you really need to get this right. So on the invoice, there are some items of information that are must-have. There's some items of information that are really nice to have, and there's some items of information that are sometimes required, sometimes not. It really just depends on the measure itself, and we'll get into that. So here are the must-have items. First, it must say invoice. If it says purchase order or anything else, it's not going to cut it. We also need the invoice number and the invoice date. We'll need your information. We'll need the installation address. Again, just make sure that the installation address matches the service address that's found on the 3rd page of the bill. Manufacturer and model number. If you're applying for a LED or food service rebate, just make sure the manufacturer and model number matches the QPL. We'll need the quantity of items purchased, the amount, the total. Then we'll need to see the total material cost. If there is installation, we need to see the installation cost broken out, the tax, the total cost, and then also we need to see payment terms. So that can be paid in full, due net 30, whatever works for you. Here's the nice to have items. These aren't necessarily required, but it does help speed up the process. The first is the rebate code, rebate amount, the total rebate, net cost, and then an OBF application number if applicable. It's important to note, however, that the rebate code is required on on-bill financing projects. So it's not a bad idea to get in the habit of putting it on your invoice. Now let's look at the information that might be required, and that's the description. And let me explain. Remember, thinking like a processor, they are trying to identify exactly what measure you are applying for and that it meets the eligibility requirements. Now, if it's, say, an LED lighting product, you don't necessarily need a description. And the reason being because we're simply going to look up the manufacturer and model number on the QPL, and if it's a match, then we pay based on the rebate code. Sometimes, however, having the manufacturer and model number isn't enough for our processors to identify what measure you're applying for and that it meets the eligibility requirements. In this example, we're applying for rebate code IR006. This is an irrigation VFD, and you can see that the rebate is paid based on horsepower. You'll also see that the rebate is broken out depending on whether it's a well pump or a booster pump. So simply having the manufacturer and the model number doesn't necessarily tell us that it's a well pump. It also doesn't tell us the horsepower. So in the description field, you can see that I have put two 50 horsepower VFDs, and in parentheses I put well pump. It's important to note that on irrigation pump VFDs and process fan VFDs, if there is a discrepancy between the horsepower of the motor and the horsepower of the VFD, we pay a rebate based on the horsepower of the motor. Moving on. The next rebate we're applying for is demand control ventilation, and you can see that this rebate is broken out depending on the type of unit. And in this case, the rebate is paid based on the tonnage of the unit. So you can see that in the description field, I've put DCV, demand control ventilation, on 20-ton package unit, and in parentheses I put gas bag. Finally, let's look at one that's a bit more complicated, and this being pipe insulation. You'll see that the rebate is broken out depending on whether or not it's hot water, low pressure steam, or high pressure steam. Also, the rebate varies depending on the diameter of the pipe. Finally, in the project requirements, it states that the application must include the manufacturer's name, installation material type, and material K-value rating. So in this case, we're applying for the measure code H669, which is high pressure steam. And you can see that in the description field, I put 120 linear feet of high pressure steam pipe, installation thickness equals 1.5 inch, pipe diameter equals 2 inches, and the material is polyfoam and the K value is 2. Now, most measures won't require this level of detail. I simply point it out so that when you start working on your own application and putting together your invoice, that you can start to connect the dots between what you are submitting and what the processors are looking for. Before we jump into the other paperwork, I just wanted to mention that if you would like to receive an Excel version of the invoice template that we've shown here today, we'd be happy to send it to you. Just send an email to tradeprohelp@pge.com, subject line, hole-in-one. Next up is the Project Contractor Licensing and Permit Certification Form. This is also known as the TPA form. This form states two things. One, that the work was done by a licensed contractor, and two, if permits were required, then permits were pulled. And in most cases, you're simply going to need to fill out steps 1 and step 2. Step 3 is really only required if you're doing heavy mechanical like a furnace. You can download the form at pg.com/contractorform. Next is the specification sheet. You can typically find these on the manufacturer's website or on the distributor's website. And then if you're applying for an LED rebate, then we'll need to have a screenshot of the LED qualified products listing. And when you bring it up, what we'd ask you to do is to click on this View Product Details and then grab a screenshot of what you see here. And the reason being is because the processors, they need to see this DLC qualified on date, the rated metrics, and then also they want to see the time date stamp in the bottom. When you save this file, what we would suggest is that you use the naming convention QPL-LT015 or whatever the rebate code is. And the reason being is because you want the processor to be able to instinctively know what your files are without having to open them. If you think about it, given the number of applications they submit, you want your paperwork to reflect organized books on a library shelf versus a pile of dirty laundry. So let's look at some common mistakes. First is that the invoice is not clear as to what was purchased or the cost involved. 2, the address on the invoice or the TPA form does not match the service address on the bill. 3rd, the manufacturer information is missing. 4th, that the LED fixture is not found on the QPL. And what we see a lot of times is that the contractor puts the part number or the model number as it's found on the invoice that they receive from the distributor, and that's not always how it's going to be listed on the QPL. So what we suggest is that you locate the fixture on the QPL and then copy and paste it into the invoice. This just helps us locate it and ensure that the process goes smooth. Number 5, we've seen in many cases where the TPA form isn't submitted, and then finally the purchase order is submitted instead of the invoice. Moving on, we've already covered these 4 documents that are required: the invoice, the TPA form, the spec sheet, and the QPL screenshot. However, it's important to note that additional documentation may be required depending on the measure that you're applying for. The takeaway is that you want to read the fine print in the catalog. The catalogs that you see online at pg.com/businessrebates are the same catalogs that our processing team uses to verify eligibility. And under the project requirements and the application process, in some cases you'll see additional information that is required. So make sure that you read through this before you submit. As we wrap up, let's do a quick knowledge check. I wonder if anybody was able to spot what is wrong in this invoice. Well, remember when I said that if there's a discrepancy between the motor horsepower and the VFD horsepower that we pay based on the motor horsepower? Well, in this invoice we only stated the horsepower for the VFD. What we'd want to do is to submit not only the horsepower for the VFD but also for the motors. Well, that about does it. Thank you so much for your time. We hope that you have found this video helpful as you navigate the rebate process. And if you have any questions that weren't addressed on the video, be sure to check out the frequently asked questions. The URL is pg.com/tradeprohelp. Before you go, we just wanted to mention that if you're a Trade Professional Alliance member and you'd like to have your Trade Pro manager come out with a big oversized check for a photo op, just reach out to your Trade Pro manager and we'll try to make that happen for you. If you'd like to learn more about the Trade Professional Alliance program, please visit us online at www.pge.com/tradepro.